Awesome. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Cyber Podcast, brought to you by Firetail. I'm your host, Jeremy. I am really excited to be coming to you, I think, for only the fourth or fifth time live and in person with a guest. We're coming to you today from Infosecurity Europe 2024, and I am delighted to be joined by Stuart Seymour, Group Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Security Officer of VirginMedia O2. Stuart, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us.
Not at all, Jeremy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we're here at the event. I know you just, I think literally minutes before coming into recording, which again, appreciated, just finished up a panel discussion around a very important topic, and that is crisis management in cybersecurity today. Mm-hmm. So maybe just give us a summary of kind of what the discussion threads were and some of the high points.
Yeah, no, of course, Jeremy. So the discussion topics were all about preparation.
Okay.
So how do you prepare?
Yep.
And exercising. And I think the major thread there was to do with ensuring that people know their roles, know their jobs, know what they do, so that nobody goes off piste and that, you know, things are kept orderly. There's a singular source of truth, singular source of communication, and everybody knows what's going on. But and that is encompassed through exercising and preparation. The next was a discussion about plans and how do you write your plans. And I think the salient point about writing a crisis management plan is understanding your business, understanding the materiality of certain events to the business. So you'll be familiar with the CIA triad, of course. Yeah. So for some companies, integrity is king or queen. And for example, a bank. Because the data that you have can either, and if you've got the wrong data on my account, then you might plus or minus me a couple of $1,000. So integrity for banks is key. For me, it's availability. Because we have mobile telephony, we have broadband, we have television in the UK, and our customers need to be connected.
And you've probably got, emergency responders and critical services that rely on that connectivity too. Absolutely. So availability is key. Makes sense.
So for us, availability is key. And then there's confidentiality, and you're thinking about government entities and sensitive documentation, what have you. So in putting together a crisis management plan, the focus needs to be different because, for example, a government entity might not reach a crisis threshold if it has an availability incident.
I see.
But will do if it has a confidentiality incident.
I see.
And I might not have reached a crisis threshold if it isn't an availability issue. I might. But there's different companies and different industries that rely on different aspects of the CIA triad.
Makes sense.
You need to know kind of where you are, what's material to your business. And then write the plan. But then be very cognizant that no plan survives contact. We've talked about our favorite philosopher, who's Mike Tyson, who says everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And being flexible enough to be able to react to those changing circumstances.
So let me ask you a question about that in particular, right? Because look, I've prepared run books, I've prepared DR plans, I've executed DR plans only in simulation, never actually in real life. I've never, thankfully, knock on wood, never had to go through that exercise. But one of the things that I've always kind of wondered about is, when you think about that flexibility, there's kind of a trade-off that I see, and I'd be curious to get your feedback, because in a moment of crisis, you've got people acting under stress.
Yes.
You may have limited resources. You may have, crisis never comes at the opportune moment, like Monday at
Friday afternoon.
Exactly. Everybody's knocking off. Some people might have already been to the pub. Who knows, right? So there's an argument to be made that actually flexibility is bad in that situation, because what you need is a set of very prescriptive actions that can guide people through what could be a difficult decision-making environment. That's like, no, you don't need to think right now. You need to act on this plan.
And I think that's valid up to an extent. My counter argument to that would be, I think in all the crises that I've dealt with, the start has been nowhere near the what the end was, what we anticipated the end to be. And crises are dynamic in nature, and it is how you react to the crisis that might make it better or worse. So when you have a crisis, it's like a hydra. So the hydra starts off with one head, which is the event. But then depending on how you react, depending on what you say to the media, you might inadvertently create another crisis or another firestorm just by what you say or don't say. And therefore, because there is that dynamism within a crisis, you need to have that element of flexibility, and the plan cannot be that rigid. Because you give people a plan, and if it says don't do anything until you hear from me, or until you get EVP sign off to switch off the system, then there's a couple of things that happen there. For example, empowerment. People don't don't react, and a reaction at that time at that place might save the day. But if the plan is very rigid and says you cannot do that, then there might be issues with it. So no, it's good to have a plan, and I get in things like disaster recovery, or when you're more in BAU mode, like changes within IT or implementation of upgrades or patches or what have you, there needs to be a very logical sequence, and A follows B follows D, so that you don't inadvertently misstep. But certainly in my experience, a crisis takes some very unexpected twists and turns, to the point where one of the panelists today, she was describing that the major crises that she's dealt with were at one point descended into utter farce and pantomime, that you just couldn't make it up what has just happened. And that really resonated with me, because like I said, there's a dynamism and unpredictability that you need to be able to gauge.
And I think that's a fair point. I mean, look, the biggest disaster I ever dealt with in my career, the biggest IT disaster, I dealt with a cyber disaster, that was another story, but the biggest IT disaster, to your point, almost everything kind of went wrong. It was a series of kind of things, it was a mail server that crashed, and a backup server that failed, and a tape that was, I think, magnetically compromised. This is dating myself a little bit. And a robot that didn't swap out that defective tape for the next tape in the array, and all kinds of things, right? So we lost 3 days of email for the entire corporation, which was a bit of a disaster, considering email was our only communication, really. We did almost nothing over the phone. So I can kind of relate to what you're saying. So, okay, so the importance of runbooks, the importance of planning, the importance of kind of simulating those plans. How do you recommend people go about simulating those plans? I've seen, I hear a lot of arguments for tabletop exercises, and we do them ourselves on a quarterly basis. I do wonder, though, from your experience and your perspective, is it enough, or is that like a good starting point, but you need to do more?
No, I think that is a really good starting point. And I think that tabletops, people lose their way. I think we were chatting earlier in the panel, where you have some vendors or some people that just make the crisis just so difficult and extreme that you all decide to go to the pub and just call it a day, because you're all doomed. And I've actually sat in one of those in one of my previous employments, where we had a big room, and everyone in the corporation came in, and we had this vendor come in, and it got bad, then it got really bad, then there was a hurricane that ripped through the data center, and then that same hurricane came and ripped through HQ, and then 5 of us died, then all of this, and it gets to a point. I think my point is realism, right? That you're just so backed into a corner that you're like, do you know what, the value of this is just been drastically diminished. But in exercising and in tabletopping, what is crucial is, for me, is the understanding of people's roles and responsibilities. So if you think about a sports team, and if you think about football or soccer, the defender needs to know that they stay here, or they come up for corners, or they don't come up for corners, and everyone knows what their role is, because like I said, with the Hydra, lots of heads get grown when people suddenly decide to, to go off piste. And it's very tempting because, there's a sort of a hero aspect. I want to be the one that solves it, or I want to be the one that tells the CEO, or I want to be, and it's very hard to tell a senior leader to sit on your hands and trust the process. So the exercising is really good. But for me, what's even better is when you have an event, is that you really learn the lessons and you have a culture of psychological safety where you can say, what went well and what didn't go so well and why didn't it go so well. And we're human and humans make mistakes, and humans make more mistakes when they've been burning midnight oil, getting 1 hour's sleep in 72 hours and not eating, and so having the psychological safety to learn and then embed I think is really, really important.
Such a key point. I mean, I spent most of my career in smaller organizations where I think we tend to have, as smaller organizations, you have a bit less hierarchy. You tend to have a little bit more of that kind of psychological openness. The time that I have spent at larger companies, I've noticed more of an attitude of, okay, something went wrong, who's to blame, as opposed to what's to blame. And then, correct. To your point, or I think maybe to the point you're kind of implying here, is like, you as an organization don't learn if the people in there feel like what they need to do is defend themselves in their own actions, and they can't own up to a mistake that they might have made, that everybody else would actually learn from. So it's such a key point.
Absolutely. And I think you summarized it very elegantly. And I think that is a sort of a root of the issue, and it's, in many respects, it's quite sad and it's quite disappointing, because actually you've gone through all this pain. And what a shame that you can't prevent someone else going through all this pain, because you're not institutionalizing this. And it's almost like, if you're a father and you have your son, and you say, you're coaching your son through something, a mistake that you made, you do that openly and lovingly because you know that your son will be better for it. And it's a shame that in some companies you can't do that to that extent, because that psychological safety isn't there, because people have seen that when someone's brave enough to say, look, that was my mistake and I'm owning it, and then they see them with a cardboard box.
This is interesting. I mean, I've got a friend who is shall remain nameless. He's a VP at one of the largest cloud companies in the world. We'll leave it there. And he made a point to me years ago when we were talking about a challenge that an organization I was with at the time was going through. And the way he said it to me was, an organization really is its culture. And 100%. I think that is a point that we don't think about as much in cybersecurity, I think, because we tend to be so focused on the technology aspect of it that we sometimes forget, we kind of depersonify or dehumanize the technical nature of the domain space that we're working in.
And I think your friend is incredibly sage. And that is why some people, and typically people that have been around the block a bit, won't work in certain companies. Even if the offer is stratospheric, and I would not work for some people that I've worked with historically for all the tea in China. Because you kind of carry your scars, but you only go so far, because you have, okay, I carry the scars, and I don't have regrets having those scars. It was really unpleasant, dealing with that individual. However, I've learned a lot, and I've learned what to be, what not to be. But at the end of the day, at this point in my career, I choose not to work in a company that has that culture, that has that mindset, that has that lack of empowerment, protectionism, and all those sort of things, which start putting more heads on the hydro or what have you, because I think without that psychological safety, you then start getting things like, well, I know that the platform's on fire, and I know that the fire extinguisher's there, but I'm not going to get this fire extinguisher until my boss approves me
to get that
fire extinguisher. But then my boss has to then say, well, has legal had a look at you taking the fire extinguisher, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's the culture that breeds, as opposed to just do the right thing, bring the fire extinguisher, and then if someone wants to send you a bill for $20 for the fire extinguisher, I'll gladly pay it. Right. But at least the building didn't burn down.
Yeah. I want to come back to two things you said earlier when we think about kind of tabletop exercises or planning, or response plans, etc. You made a point that I think is very valid, and it's certainly something that I know for myself. I think it was about 6 months on the job, and we accidentally deleted 80% of the data in our CRM.
Oops.
Yeah. Now, thankfully, we had a backup, and we were able to restore. And it was an annoying loss of 4 hours of my life or something like that. But I went through that learning exercise. You mentioned earlier that in crisis response, you get a lot of exercise and experience from having gone through it a couple times.
Yeah.
And undoubtedly, the best crisis response teams are the ones that have been through big blow-ups or massive network outages, or when, I don't know if this has ever happened, hopefully not, but when every O2 customer can't send a text for 5 minutes or something like that. These types of big events, you learn so much from them. They're formative. You learn about yourself. You learn about the organization, what stresses, etc. To that end, if you're thinking about putting together a plan, and you look at the roles and responsibilities, and you mentioned earlier that it's so key to figure out what everybody's role is in that response plan, etc. Does that impact or inform the way you think about assigning different people as primary responder for, network connectivity is this, secondary is that? How do you balance that out? Because then you also have this kind of secondary concern of, I need coverage, I need the best people, but I can't have all the best people as the primary people and then just rely on those people being available because they might be on vacation, they might leave the organization, etc.
So right. So for me, a really mature organization that excels in crisis management, it's kind of like an ice hockey team.
Okay.
And if you watch an ice hockey match and you see the first three and then
your front line, your back line,
and you see them swap in and out,
it's continuous.
Seamless. It's seamless. The game doesn't stop. People don't come on, don't come off. And the second line knows all of their roles and responsibilities.
That's right.
And I think that's also really, really important, because if you look at the final aspect of a crisis, which is, people's welfare, burnout, stress, how many 4-minute miles with 50 kilos on your back can you actually do? That was one of the questions that we dealt with as a panel, and my thoughts on that are, we actually are in control of some of that as cybersecurity leaders, because I can train and empower that second line. And I can ensure that when that second line comes in, they have the experience to know what to do, how to do it, how to move, how not to move. In a microcosm, or at a much, much lower level, it's almost akin to when your boss goes on holiday and says, I will not be turning on my phone, I will not be turning on my emails, because I know you've got this. And you also in turn feel confident enough that you got this, and that you might make the best decision that you can at the time, and it might not be the 100% amazing decision, but it might be 80%, but that you have that psychological safety again. So I think if you sort of move it towards the sort of the latter aspect of the crisis, and look at something which is supremely important, which is the people, I think that ice hockey analogy is a really good one.
And it kind of makes sense, right? your starting center might be slightly better than your backup center, but if they both know their roles, they both understand the task at hand, then yeah, you can get through that. I'm curious about one other aspect of kind of your views on overall crisis management right now, because we're right now in a time when two things have happened to the broader cyber landscape, in particular to people like yourself. Mm-hmm. Number one is you're now increasingly, I don't know if it's been a thing over here in the UK as much, but in the US right now, there is statutory regulation around the timeline for reporting material events. Mm-hmm. And number two is we're starting to see targeted legal action towards leaders in of companies or organizations that have suffered massive breaches. I'm curious what the thinking is from your perspective about either of those things, either from your own perspective or what you're hearing from your peers.
So it's interesting. So we also in the UK have, regulation and regulatory imperatives. And my thoughts are that if there's regulation, it's because it's needed.
Okay.
And if there's regulation, predominantly, it's because there have been, significant, corporate missteps in the past.
Right.
So you had the Enron scandal.
Yeah.
And then there was regulation that followed that.
Sarbanes-Oxley.
So that Enron could never, ever happen again.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right, Sarbanes-Oxley. And Sarbanes-Oxley is there because there was clear evidence that there were significant companies that were Fortune high, like Enron, that did wrong.
Yep.
So I per se as a philosophy and with my team embrace regulation.
Okay.
Where regulation is, and of course the regulators have to start somewhere.
Right.
And they can, and it's a very different to conceive something philosophically or conceive something in paper.
Yep.
And then conceive something in action.
Yeah.
And then the two, the theory and the practice sometimes, don't align. And again, hearing from my peers, I believe that some of the reporting that you have to do is no later than
96 hours or something.
Like that, yeah. And of course, as you're putting out a fire, what you don't want is a distraction of having to
prepare a report.
And of course, in preparing a report, it has to go through, scrutiny, and rightly so. And it's one of these things that, but you can influence the regulator. And as an industry, you can go to the regulator and say, if, and I'm plucking this out of thin air,
sure.
If the regulatory requirement is that we meet you and your regulatory team, every 5 days at, your location at this time.
Right.
That's a made-up example.
Yeah.
You can say to the regulator, do you know what? I'm spending more time actually meeting you, briefing you about this issue than actually fixing the issue that you really, really, really care about.
Right. Protecting the data, restoring trust, whatever that is.
Whatever that issue might be. So I think there is an opportunity, as industries get together to work with regulators to say, when you said that you need this in, 12 hours.
Right.
Do you really need it in 12 hours?
Yeah.
And why do you need it in 12 hours? Because what I'm going to be doing in the first 12 hours is actually
digging through logs. I mean,
correct. Not this.
Yeah.
But now you're forcing me to put this on the top of my agenda, which means that I don't get to manage the incident, which means that I might not be able to contain it as well as I can, which means that the incident then gets Do you really need it in 12 hours? Or will 72 do?
Yeah.
Or will a day do?
So to your point, regulation, probably because it's needed. Is the regulation spot on as to where it needs to be? Don't know yet, maybe?
No.
Okay.
No. And that's something that gets tested and adjusted, and I think it's incumbent on industry, so for me, the telecoms industry, to work alongside our regulator to say, I understand your intent, I understand why you have these requirements. But let me give you my reality, and then let me test if you still need that exactly as you say.
Makes sense.
And I think in my career, I've worked with UK regulators in the past who have been receptive to say, well, look, we needed to start somewhere, and we drew a line in the sand, and maybe the line was too near. The line in the sand was too near the sea, and we need to move it further into shore. But I think fundamentally and philosophically, regulation is there because there's been a systemic failing that corporations have been unable to address themselves. Sarbanes-Oxley.
Case in point. And how do you think about the personal liability aspect of what's going on right now?
That is such a tough question. In the UK, we don't have that.
Okay.
But I have a number of friends that are either going through that or incredibly concerned. I think if you're experienced in cybersecurity, you will know that if I paint you an incident, I can either shine that incident in a really good light, or in a really negative light. And the interpretation depends on the lens that someone wants to put on it, and the point that they might wish to make. And I think it's really tough when you make that personal. I really do. However, in the UK yet, we don't have that.
And look, and I think it's generally good that you don't. One of the challenges, and I've had this conversation with a couple of people who have come on the podcast talking about this, either current or former chief information security officers. One of the challenges around information security, as opposed to accounting kind of always has a right and wrong answer. Like, numbers don't lie; they are what they are, and the formulas for generating, what is line 5 on a balance sheet is a consistent formula for every company. Whereas, to the point you raised at the beginning of the conversation, if you even just consider that initial CIA triangle, take 3 companies and they're going to have a different answer for which is the most important point out of those 3.
Absolutely.
And that's going to inform their defenses and their security posture and everything around it.
Absolutely. And, I detected this hostile party in my network, and I chose to kick them out immediately. One outcome. I detected this hostile party in my network, and I chose to let them stay and observe so that I can gather a bit of intelligence, so that I can see, what they may or may not be doing and what their MO, so that further down the line, when I know that, they always go in the front door, turn left and left again, I can then put proactive doors.
That left hallway, that's really the key priority.
For the next time. Now, I kick them out straight away, or I let them to observe them to then defend. You can interpret those as, oh my goodness, I kick them out straight away. This person just does not know what they're doing. Or, oh my God, this person is amazing. He was spot on, switch on, swift,
quick response, etc.
And exactly the same thing. Oh my goodness, this person is so experienced because he knows that the attack will come again, and he knows that
they didn't get anything sensitive yet. Let's watch them. Let's figure out.
And how could you let an attacker stay there? They could have set the whole thing on fire, etc. How could you take that, monumental risk? Which one is right? Which one is wrong? And then you combine that quite rightly to say that not all companies are equal, and not all companies have the same imperatives and the same drivers. The CIA triad being but one example of that. Then it becomes, contrary to accounting, it becomes a lot more nuanced. It becomes qualitative as opposed to quantitative.
And that's the key point, right? Accounting and all that stuff is very much quantitative, and security is qualitative. And on the quantity side, I know one of the common frustrations that I hear is that, this role of chief information security officer is still very new, kind of
Yes.
across the broader industry. And it's also not universal in the sense of like, I have a friend who likes to call it the big C, little c.
Yeah.
Are you a chief information security officer with a seat on the board or in the boardroom and engaged at that level, who, by the way, gets to argue for and set budget? Or are you a little c who might report to a chief financial officer or report to a chief information officer or whatnot?
Yeah.
And you don't control your budget, and that very much potentially limits what you can do from a security perspective.
Or are you a big C in the first chapter and a little c in the second chapter, right? And then there's various. Yeah, no, I think that's a very sage question to be thinking about. Yeah.
Well, I want to wrap up, Stuart, with just a couple questions. I mean, we're here at Infosecurity Europe. This is arguably the largest cybersecurity conference in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
What have you seen this year that's been interesting for you?
So for me, a lot of the shared experiences on the Keynote panel were really super interesting.
Yep.
The talk on neurodiversity, I'm neurodiverse, I'm dyslexic, and that's a passion that I have.
Yeah.
For me, and the starting to talk about neurodiversity and it not being more mainstream within cybersecurity and really harnessing the unique gifts that someone who is neurodiverse has. I think that was very, very good. And the more we talk about it and the more we bring it to the fore, the better. Nice to see old colleagues and friends.
Always.
Lovely to see that.
Yeah.
And lovely to meet with partners and vendors that provide services for us and reestablish that relationship. I think since COVID, a lot of interaction is now on Teams or Zoom or what have you. And I think the value of that human connection can't be underestimated.
Yeah, I mean, especially the first half of the conversation we had today was about the importance of having open spaces for people to be able to be vulnerable and talk about the mistakes that they've made. And ultimately, cybersecurity is done by humans. So I totally agree with you on this point of reestablishing connections, maintaining connections with people over time.
Yeah.
I always tell people, I've worked in pure IT, I've worked in kind of hybrid IT and cyber. I've worked purely in the cloud with very little connection to cybersecurity, and then I've worked in cloud security. Cybersecurity is the space where I find the most kind of understanding that we're all actually kind of have the same mission.
Yes.
Right? It's to defend the integrity, the data, the security of the organizations that we're working for. And it's also kind of the industry where I see the most hugs happening just on a regular basis, people greeting each other after time, etc.
And the most empathy.
Yeah.
Because, and if I tell you, one of the things that I loathe on LinkedIn is when you have some CISOs that are like, hashtag data breach, hashtag Ticketmaster, hashtag, massive hack, and then repost something kind of for clicks. And that tells me that those kind of people have never really been in that pain.
Yeah.
And whenever I see, a cyber breach, because of course the criminals, what they want to do is add pressure and pressure and pressure and pressure, right? So you pay the ransom, or the board feels pressure to do this or that and the other. So you're aiding someone, you're aiding the hostile entities, but with true cybersecurity professionals who have been through that pain and who have had those shovels in the face. Sometimes it's really nice when someone just drops you a text and says, "Hey, I saw the news. Are you okay?"
Yeah.
Or can I help?
Yeah.
Or can I put my intel team on that because we're in the same industry, and what might happen to you could the crocodile might have got you, but they're coming potentially for us next.
Yeah.
And I think those people within the cybersecurity community that get it.
Yep.
And are incredibly helpful and empathetic.
Yeah.
Human.
Yeah. Human. I think that is a great point to wrap up today's conversation on. Stuart, thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely
enjoyed it.
Absolute pleasure. Join us next time on another episode of Modern Cyber. Like, subscribe, rate, review, share with friends, all that good stuff. You know what we're going to say. Talk to you next time.